Well, let's talk about some of the actual critiques that these writers are putting forth. These writers, these artists, these agitators. One is unquestionably that of gender equality and of the oppression of women and of the question of women's place in society. So there are many Chinese critics who are saying that, in fact, one of the key barometers by which we can understand whether or not China is an advanced or a backward nation, and I'm using the terminology of the era, is by identifying the status of women. Because when we look out upon the world, when we look out upon Western Europe or upon North America, the United States, or we look towards Japan, we see that women in these societies have made profound advances that at present are unimaginable within our current political, cultural, and social context. And so the activism around women's emancipation, women's right to vote, women's right to control their own bodies, women's right to enter public spaces becomes a real movement and also becomes, in a sense, a symbol that largely male protagonists can deploy as part of a larger set of critiques that they want to issue against Chinese society, civilization, and the government. But one of the emblems in particular that is picked up is that of, and practices, I mean, it's both practice and emblem, is that of foot binding as, in essence, the quintessential example of how Chinese civilization for centuries has subjected women to oppression. So we have some of the most profound critiques which are coming out and which are published in journals like New Youth, among the dozens and dozens and dozens of others, being addressing the question, the so-called women's question. And one passage here from Shen Zimin, The Current Position of Women, gives us a sense of not just the content of these critiques, but also the form. Here's what it says. Women have their own reasons for exchanging their only possession, their sexual services, in order to avoid the isolation of remaining single, or to fulfill a desire to become a mother, or to have their vanity indulged. Women often marry men they do not love. Emotionally, and here is where we get to the form of critique, their predicament is similar to the experience of prostitutes, where they have to painfully submit to their husbands and put up with fondling caresses in the absence of love. Now, I want to take a moment here to point out the strategy that underlies this particular critique. In a nutshell, this critique is drawing an equation between marriage and prostitution. Keep in mind, not bad marriages, not marriages that have gone wrong by the contemporary standards of what constitutes a good or a bad marriage, but all marriage as it is practiced in China at this time is comparable to the predicament of prostitutes. Now, why is that such a disturbing or unsettling kind of critique? Because it is pointing at something that is understood not only as normal within contemporary Chinese society by anyone reading this essay, but in fact is understood as a good thing, as a positive thing, something to be celebrated. The marriage of a daughter into a family is a moment of celebration for the parents of that daughter. And as in many societies, the marriage as the first stage of forming a family and having children and so forth is understood as a moment of social stability, of something good. In this critique, however, the idea is marriage as it is practiced and as it actually functions, like if we really look at it, it has the qualities of prostitution, which is a person who does not get to choose who they love, and secondly, does it not out of reasons of independence or not out of reasons of sentiment, but as a kind of exchange in a world that has denied them anything but their sexual services. So this form of critique will be at the heart of so many of the critiques that we are going to encounter during the May 4th movement, both with regard to the women's question, but also with a great many others. One might say that, nowadays we talk about structural critique. In the case of the United States, we talk about discussions of systemic racism and so forth. Well, that form of critique was not born in the 1960s, and it certainly wasn't born in the 2010s and 20s. This kind of structural critique has its inception really at the turn of the century in a great many places. But in China, one might point to the end of the Qing dynasty and the beginning of the Republican era as a moment when this form of critique, structural critique with all of these different rhetorical strategies, really kind of comes into its own, so to speak. Now, there is within this this particular domain of new culture movement critique, the women question, there is its own story of journal cultures and institutions. So we see at this time the proliferation of dozens, if not hundreds, of journals, big and small, long-lasting and ephemeral, that focus on the women's question or the life of women, the life of girls, and also women as consumers. That is, it might not be expressly about women per se, but it's about various aspects of life that the publishers believe will be of interest to women, and therefore we can start to bring in consumer culture targeting women. And this brings up a kind of this sheds light on a kind of tension or contradiction that we see in this particular domain of new culture critique. And I'll come back to this image here, which is if we what exactly is the goal of a great many of these journals that are proliferating during May 4th movement and new culture movement that are targeting women? Are they, for lack of a better word, sincerely after women's emancipation? Or are they exploiting the broader zeitgeist of the women question and those who are agitating for women's emancipation and equality in order to sell women face cream and to sell clothing and cigarettes and all of these things? So there is a question and a tension at the heart here that will the kind of journal culture that we see be overtaken by and large by global capitalism? And global capitalism through the means of advertising culture and consumer culture, which is really exploding in China at this time, is it just putting on the guise of a goal for women's emancipation and women's equality, or is it actually trying to agitate for the fundamental restructuring of society as we know it? There's a great deal of reason to think that it may be certainly as much the former as the latter, and maybe a bit more the former than the latter. And in fact, there are many essays by contemporaries who point out this very issue. What a number of essayists will point out during this period is, isn't it interesting that all of these men, these male feminists, are speaking on behalf of women, like speaking on behalf of the need for emancipation. So in a certain sense, men are once again reasserting their position at the top of the hierarchy of those who should be allowed to speak and those whose voices count. And yet now they're achieving that position in the apex by ostensibly acting, in a contemporary term, woke. So basically there is the problem then, as we see in many other parts of the 20th century and into the 21st century, of fake woke male feminists. That's not to say that there are no men who are not sincerely committed to the fundamental restructuring of society at this time or now, but there are those who wonder. Another reason to call this into question has to do with the actual ownership structure of many of these journals. You will see, as I mentioned, dozens of journals with women or woman or girl or something like that in the title, and ostensibly is about women. But if you look at the editorial committee, they will be and the publisher, it'll be owned by men, featuring predominantly male writers, et cetera, et cetera. So the ownership structure of these journals are predominantly men, and yet they are ostensibly for and about women. So this is inherent in the tension within the new culture movement and its approach to the questions of women's equality. I won't dwell heavily, but there are also important transnational dimensions here. A great number of feminists and theorists from other countries will make tours of China. One will be Margaret Sanger, who visits China in 1922 and lectures on, among other things, women's access to birth control, and therefore the right to maintain control over reproduction, and that this is something that should inherently and fundamentally be under the control of a woman, not under the control of society or of men. And there is, following in the course of Sanger's tour through China and the various lectures, there is this proliferation of essays that are trying to deal with and think against and think through what Sanger is saying. And then very famously, there is a staging of A Doll's House by Ibsen in China. And I won't go into the plot of A Doll's House, but for anyone who hasn't seen it or hasn't read it, be sure to. And for those of you who do, you know about what happens with the protagonist, Nora, at the end of that play. And the question becomes, could there ever be a Chinese Nora? Could someone have done in China what Nora does within this play, within this context? And it, once again, generates a very dynamic set of essays and proliferations and discussions, thinking with, against, alongside this play, so much so that it's sometimes referred to as at the time, a Nora phenomenon, like it just sort of sweeps through. Now, coming back to the question of that contradiction I mentioned between sort of sincere efforts to rebuild the structure of society, the economy, and so forth, versus more or less consumer capitalism finding another market in young women, and finding these advertising culture and ways of getting various forms of products in the hands of this vast new market, i.e., Chinese women. This brings us back to an anxiety that was at the core of the women's question within China itself, and especially among men. And this was the dialectic between new women and modern girls. And within this valence, in a nutshell, new women are good for China, modern, emancipated, civic-minded, whatever. And modern girls was held up as dangerous, bad, as all of the ways in which the transformation of Chinese society could go off the rails and generate, for lack of a better sort of image, those kinds of girls that end up in nightclubs and date, whoever they see fit, wearing whatever they see fit, and smoking and an affront to filial duties and so forth and so on. And these two images, largely generated and circulated by men, were in essence a means of continuing to police female bodies, women, in the context of an ostensibly open-minded critique and engagement with questions of the oppression of women. Because it was, once again, men who could hold up these two images as the guardrails, as it were, between how an emancipated woman should look versus how an emancipated woman should not look. And this is held up in these two images. And incidentally, this idea of the modern girl as this destabilizing, anxiety-producing figure, anxiety-producing for men, that is, and for a good number of women, but largely for men, is actually a global phenomenon. There's a fantastic edited volume, Modern Girl Around the World, which talks about this phenomenon and anxiety in a number of different contexts surrounding questions of women's equality. Now, once again, I'll give you just one more passage from this particular area of New Culture era critique, and then we'll move on. But I want to show you an early essay by a man we'll come to know fairly well, Mao Zedong, in 1919, called The Question of Miss Zhao's Personality. Now, Miss Zhao, the Miss Zhao being referred to here, was a young woman who was betrothed to be married, and on the day that she was to be married, smuggled a blade, a knife, a razor blade into the bridal sedan and took her own life en route to the ceremony. I think to the husband to be's home. And news of this suicide was picked up by the journals of the day and circulated widely. And what erupted was, in essence, a journal-based debate over what this suicide meant or signified for the status of women within Chinese society. And there are a variety of essays about this. Some were arguing that this tells us nothing about the status of women. It has to do with the fundamental weakness of Miss Zhao's personality. She was simply a weak person. Therefore, we cannot ascribe things to this tragic act of her suicide. All the way to another end of this discussion, which would say, if we really analyze the facts here, Miss Zhao, although the vehicle of her own death, is not the force that killed Miss Zhao. Chinese society killed Miss Zhao. She just happened to be holding the blade at the time. So again, a structural critique of this young woman's death. I give you this passage by Mao Zedong not to suggest that Mao was at the forefront of this discussion, but rather that Mao at this time was largely a very derivative young thinker who was advancing certainly this further end of the structural critique, which says that no, Miss Zhao is not just some weak individual who couldn't withstand, life as we know it, and therefore took her own life, but was killed by Chinese society. It's a very powerful structural critique of the situation. But at the same time, if you are to read other essays by more sort of senior members of the new culture movement, they are saying this before Mao does. And so Mao is, in a certain sense, this agitator, this bomb thrower, very smart bomb thrower, but still is a very derivative thinker at this point. Nevertheless, I invite you to look at this passage and once again compare it in your mind to the earlier passage that equates marriage with prostitution. In this particular passage, marriage is being equated with rape. So once again, taking something that is held as normal, good, just not even thought of, surfacing it, saying, let's look at actually how it functions as a system, and then ask ourselves, what other systems in the world do we know of that sound like that? Oh, those systems are horrible, are horrifying, but they are dynamically the same, phenomenologically the same. So therefore, they are the same. And that's what we need to change. That's why we need to change and what we need to change about our own society.